Chapter 2206. I heard that sometimes women don't mean what they say. His voice was hoarse. Let me check. As she screamed, he got what he wanted. How could she not miss him? They were in such a situation. She was a normal woman, and she had liked him so much. In the end, it was a little crazy. She was a little anxious because of him, and she wasn't as obedient as before in the mirror. There was a lingering figure. As the temperature rose, the mirror became blurry. When everything calmed down, he leaned on her shoulder and bit her. Are you okay? She turned her face away. Not good. Her tone was a little unhappy and a little angry. Yi chuckled and kissed her neck. I'll take you to take a shower. At this moment, in his heart, they were already together again. He was willing to dote on her as much as he wanted. When she first came back, he actually hated her. He was thinking of how to treat her cruelly and get back at her for all these years. But he was actually weaker than her, and he couldn't stand the loneliness. He had been lonely for so long that he couldn't reject her company. She could scold him, hit him, or anything else, as long as she was by his side. When he turned on the shower to clean her up, his heart was full, and he continued kissing her. Cher didn't want to talk to him. After she couldn't stand it anymore, she said, Yi, we're just not that intimate. Don't be like this. She couldn't bear his kindness. He didn't stop and just glanced at her. Do you think that doing it again will prove whether we're intimate or not? He paused for a moment and said in a tone that made people's hair stand on end. If you want to continue, I don't mind doing it again. Cher covered her face and didn't say anything. The water continued to flow, and she was very close to him. Slowly, she tasted the sweetness of blood. When she looked up, she was stunned. His forehead was broken, and dark red blood was slowly flowing down. Why didn't you say so earlier? Her voice was a little anxious. She reached out to touch his forehead, but the more she touched, the more red water poured down. She bit her lips. Yi, are you an idiot? You're clearly injured, so why did you use hot water to wash it? This way, the wound will open up, okay? He was unmoved. He even grabbed her little hand and looked at her with a burning gaze. Because of this, you will be anxious and nervous about me. He looked at her with bitterness in his heart. Cher, no one has ever dared to call me an idiot. You are the first. Only in front of you. I am an idiot because of love so stupid. You were so angry, so concerned about my shamelessness last night, so I could only hurt myself. This way, you probably wouldn't be in the mood to be angry. He admitted that he was despicable and shameless, but for the sake of the person he liked, why not be careful? From the bottom of his heart, the current Zhou Chengwang was the same type of person as him. He didn't mind if Qin Mu fell in love with Zhou Chengwang once more, as long as Zhou Chengwang treated Qin Mu well. But he was different from Cher. She seemed to have many secrets in her heart. Since she wasn't willing to say them out and get close to him, he could only force himself on her. He didn't care about his injury. After all, he wouldn't die. But Cher cared. She hurriedly turned off the hot water and dragged him to the bedroom. Along the way, there were splashes everywhere. Chapter 2207. She returned to the bed with much difficulty and found the first aid kit in the suite with a pale face. She didn't even bother to put on her clothes and came over to help him apply the medicine. Put on your clothes? He leaned against the headboard with an unfathomable gaze. Cher glared at him. I won't catch a cold. As she said that, she applied the medicine for him carefully. She was kneeling in front of him. To be honest, this posture was indeed a huge test for him. Yi Muyun admired it for a long time before saying indifferently, I'm afraid I won't be able to control myself. Cher paused and shifted her gaze to his face. Although he looked like a precious jade, the words that came out of his mouth were extremely shameless. She covered herself immediately and bit her lips. You're still thinking about that when things are already like this. It's not like I'm going to die. His voice became even softer as he grabbed her shoulders and asked softly, Were you satisfied last night? Cher's face blushed. She wanted to escape, but she couldn't. She could only pretend to apply the medicine for him carefully. She despised him in her heart. He was no different from Zhou Chengwang right now. Despising him was one thing, but she didn't want anything to fall behind just because they had a night together. She thought that they should leave well and not owe each other anything. Cher's gaze fell on the bin beside the bed. There were 5 to 6 zero ones in it, all of which were used by them last night. There were 2 more in the bathroom. She thought that he really couldn't control himself. Was he too hungry all these years? Why? She was too embarrassed to ask what she wanted to ask. Yimian looked at her and touched the gauze on his forehead. He smiled. Why do I need protection? Schweppe knelt in front of him, her eyes watery as she nodded. Because I don't want you to take the medicine. He sighed. Cher, I promise that I won't let you get pregnant before you're willing. When she heard that, she didn't feel too touched. She just felt a little embarrassed. What were they now? They were nothing. Because she couldn't, she lowered her eyes. Rest for a while. I'll get someone to clean it up. He didn't lose a lot of blood, but he had just flushed it. She was afraid that it would get infected, and that would be troublesome. She had only moved a little when he caught her arm. His voice was extremely hoarse. Sleep with me for a while. Before she came back to her senses, she was tightly hugged in his arms. He hugged her like how he used to hug a child in the past. Placing her in his arms, he rested his chin on her hair and said in a low voice, Cher, stay with me. I'm very sleepy and tired. All these years, he had almost never had a good night's sleep. When he woke up, he would always feel that his side was empty. Later, he developed the habit of sleeping only 4 hours a day. He was afraid that he would forget her. Cher stayed in his arms, feeling a little sad. She didn't know whether it was for him or for herself. She knew that what she was doing now was unfair to him. She should make it clear to him, but she couldn't. Hugging him with her slender arms, she told herself that she would indulge herself just this once. After this was over, she would leave. This time around, he would probably hate her even more and forget about her. The 2 of them hugged and fell asleep slowly. Even their breathing was mixed together, blending together in a strange way. When Cher woke up, she felt a burning sensation. Hugging her was a warm body. Chapter 2208. Cher pursed her lips, not knowing what to do. She knelt beside him for a long time before she reached out and said in a trembling voice, Brother. Yimian slowly opened his eyes and saw her anxious look. He seemed to have heard her calling him brother. It had been a long time since she had called him brother from the bottom of her heart. He had forced her to call him brother previously, so it was naturally different from this. Don't cry. He reached out and caressed her face. It's just a little fever, it's nothing. Cher's eyes were filled with tears, and she said in a low voice, I'll call the doctor for you then. There would definitely be a doctor on duty in such a big hotel. Yimian was also really uncomfortable. She closed her eyes and let out a sound of agreement. The voice that came out of his throat was hoarse and unclear. It was obvious how uncomfortable he was at the moment. She got up and put on some clothes. After thinking about it, she helped him pull up his bathrobe. Yimian opened his eyes and looked at her. Then he chuckled softly. You're still concerned about this even at this stage. I'm not as thick-skinned as you. Cher's voice was soft, and she ran out. When Yimian heard the door close, he smiled helplessly. He lay there quietly, feeling as though his body was being torn apart. It was very painful, but last night, he had enjoyed it to his heart's content. Especially when he was taking her, she kept crying in his arms, and that gave him a great sense of satisfaction. The corners of his chapped lips turned up into a smile. After some time, the door opened again, and the person who had just arrived came over quietly. Cher, he called out to her as he searched for her by the bed. Cher hesitated for a moment, but she still went forward and grabbed his hand. She said softly, I'm here. He pursed his lips and chuckled. Is the doctor here? At this moment, an unfamiliar voice said, Mr. Yi, let me help you take a look at your wound. Yimian nodded and slowly opened his eyes. He looked at the doctor, but did not let go of the young lady's hand. Looking at the situation, the doctor could roughly guess what was going on. After all, the couple's bodies were in a terrible state. He sighed in his heart. They really went too far. He stepped forward, removed the gauze, and carefully examined the wound. It was indeed a little inflamed, but a small wound should not have been inflamed to this extent. The doctor coughed lightly. Mr. Ye's injury still needs to rest. It's not suitable for strenuous exercise. Yimian propped himself up and leaned against the headboard. He glanced at Cher and smiled faintly. Young and mischievous. Cher was infuriated. He was the one who was shameless, yet he was trying to pin the blame on her. She expressed that she would not take the blame. But the doctor didn't think so. His gaze fell on Yi Muyun's neck, and then he shook his head. Don't do any strenuous exercise. Family members should be more patient with the patient. There's still a long way to go. Cher was about to explode, but he couldn't deny it. How could he say it out loud? Her gloomy expression pleased Mr. Yi. He kept holding her hand and rubbed it gently. The doctor took out the medicine box. As he prepared the medicine, he said, I'll give you an antipyretic shot and an anti-inflammatory shot first to see if it will improve. If it doesn't work, you'll have to go to the hospital for an intravenous drip. Cher nodded. Sorry to trouble you. The doctor gestured for her to lift her bathrobe, indicating that he was going to give her an injection somewhere on her lower body. Yi Muyin looked at Cher. Chapter 2209. Cher pursed her lips and snorted. Do it yourself? His eyes were meaningful, and in the end, she couldn't do it for him. She closed her eyes when she did it, which was very cute. Just looking at him like that made him feel less uncomfortable. He frowned slightly when the injection was done. Cher snorted. You're already so old, yet you're still afraid of pain. She sounded a little angry when she said that. Yi Muyin stretched his eyebrows and looked at her meaningfully. Who was the one who kept complaining about pain last night? Cher could naturally see that he was shameless. She didn't say anything and just stared at him. The doctor laughed. These two were quite interesting. They were really a match made in heaven. The doctor re-inflamed the wound, left a box of anti-inflammatory medicine, and left. Cher saw the doctor off and saw that it was getting late. When she was about to call room service, Yi Muyin stopped her and said, I don't want to eat anything else. Make some porridge for me. She glared at him. It's been so many years. Don't tell me you haven't learned this? There was a hint of mockery in his tone. Cher snorted. It's such a simple thing. Do I need to learn it? He chuckled and said, Then try it. That little fool was tricked into doing it by him. She looked really cute from behind. Yi Muyin leaned against the bed quietly, his eyes deep and the smile on his face deepened. Being with her like this, no matter how uncomfortable his body was, his heart was slowly filled up. She still wanted to escape, but he wouldn't let her go. He had lost her once, and in his heart, he thought that he would find her. He was sure that she would not be able to leave him because she was so stupid, so stupid. What could Tang Shui do without Yi Muyin? However, the long wait made him slowly lose his patience. It wasn't until she appeared again that he realized that she was doing very well without him. Very well. He really didn't know whether he should be happy or unhappy. While he was thinking, the phone beside the bed rang. It was a call from Qin Mu. He picked it up and his voice was a little hoarse. Momo. Qin Mu's voice was still as gentle as before. Brother, why didn't you and Cher come out? Yi Muyin was silent for a moment. He looked in the direction of the small kitchen and slowly said, I was injured last night. Qin Mu was stunned for a moment and immediately asked worriedly, Are you okay? Just a minor injury. Yi Muyin said it indifferently, but Qin Mu still thought too much. After hanging up the phone, she looked at Zhou Chengguang. I'm going to my brother's place. I'm worried. Zhou Chengguang smiled faintly. I'll go with you. Otherwise, you'll probably feel a little uncomfortable. Sure enough, men knew men best. Qin Mu originally wanted to refuse, but in the end, she didn't and acquiesced. On the other side, Yi Muyin put down the phone and felt much better. So he lifted the quilt, got up, and walked to the small kitchen. In the morning light, the little man stood in front of the counter, a little flustered. He hugged her from behind and rested his face on her shoulder. He chuckled and said, You're so busy making porridge. Cher's body stiffened and she slowly turned around. You can do it. He smiled and said, Of course. Then, teach me, she said unexpectedly. Chapter 2210. Cher was stunned for a moment before her lips were kissed by him. She mumbled. There was still porridge in the pot, and it had to be burnt. But in Yi Muyun's mind, it didn't matter if it was burnt. His kiss was a little deep, and Cher's neck was almost sprained. She pushed him away with her little hands, but she couldn't push him away. Really, did a patient have to be so strong? She only came to her senses when the smell of burnt food drifted past her nose. She gritted her teeth. Yimiyun! The smell of burnt food got stronger. Yimiyun chuckled and let go of her to turn off the stove. At this moment, there was a knock on the door of the suite. He ordered her in a low voice. Open the door. Cher really didn't think too much. She walked over and opened the door. She was a little stunned the moment the door was opened. Qin Mu and Zhou Chengwang were standing at the door. She scratched her hair and couldn't decide whether to let them in or not. I heard from my brother that he's injured, so I came to see him. Qin Mu had always been a little timid in front of Cher, so her voice was very soft. Oh, Cher replied and opened the door wide. He's in the kitchen? Qin Mu frowned when she smelled something burnt. My brother is burnt? Cher looked a little uncomfortable. More or less. Zhou Chengwang was listening to the conversation between the two girls and felt amused, however. He clearly knew that the estrangement between them was all because of him. He didn't say anything and stood behind Qin Mu. Shui Er's gaze landed on him. When she saw the look in his eyes, she understood that Zhou Chengwang's heart was currently occupied by Qin Mu, and it held a significant weight. She thought that this was good. At least she didn't make a wrong choice 8 years ago. She could tell that Zhou Chengwang and Qin Mu should be together again. Even if Qin Mu didn't admit it, it was a fact. Thinking of this, he smiled. Come in. Qin Mu was still a little hesitant because she saw the messy bed just now. Her brother's illness should be caused by too much indulgence. The younger sister thought immorally and exchanged a glance with Zhou Chengwang. Zhou Chengwang's choice was to push her from behind. Qin Mu entered the door, and he followed. Cher closed the door and scratched her head. Yi Muyun is in the kitchen. Qin Mu looked at Zhou Chengwang and said softly, I'm going to see my brother. Zhou Chengwang, why don't you chat with Cher for a bit? Zhou Chengwang looked at his wife quietly for a long time before nodding his head. Cher, on the other hand, was a little surprised. Also, when did Qin Mu become so generous? What was there to talk about with her and Zhou Chengwang? But Qin Mu had already walked to the kitchen, leaving the space for Zhou Chengwang. At the scene, there were traces of the battle between Cher and Yi Muyun, and the atmosphere was a little ambiguous. Cher couldn't think of it, but Zhou Chengwang could guess what his little wife was thinking. She showed him these to tell him that something had happened between Cher and her brother, and that he shouldn't think about it anymore. She found it funny. Since when had he shown any interest in Tang Shuep during this reunion? Wasn't it obvious that he was behaving this night? Zhou Chengwang looked at Cher and smiled faintly. Is he okay? He paused and asked with a smile. Is Yi Muyun okay? I should be asking this. Chapter 22:11. I'm asking on behalf of Qin Mu. Zhou Chengwang strolled to the opposite side of her and sat down. I don't think Yi Muyun would tell his own sister about such an embarrassing thing. I won't tell my enemy about such an embarrassing thing either. Cher snorted softly before biting her finger and ignoring him. Zhou Chengwang chuckled. Actually, he was starting to understand why he liked Qin Mu now. In some ways, Qin Mu was a little like Tang Cher. She would occasionally be mischievous as well. However, she was her. She wasn't a substitute for Tang Cher. He couldn't be clearer about that. He was a little distracted while talking to her. Cher could naturally tell. She went straight to the point and said, You've fallen for Qin Mu, haven't you? Zhou Chengwang smiled bitterly. Am I that obvious? You have the word infatuation written all over you, Cher said mockingly. Now that I think about it, wasn't my decision back then very stupid? If you had forced Qin Mu to die back then, you probably wouldn't have been able to experience what true love feels like in this lifetime. True love. Zhou Chengwang's heart was in turmoil. In Tang Cher's heart, was his true love for Qin Mu already? Cher wasn't interested in him. She didn't say anything else after saying that. She said that not because of Zhou Chengwang, but because of Qin Mu. She wanted Qin Mu to have one more choice. A man who was dead set on her. A man she had once loved. If she wanted to love, Zhou Chengwang was a smart man. He understood it in a short while. He felt a little complicated. Then he said in a hoarse voice, Tang Cher, are you always so smart in front of others? You only act cute in front of Yi Muyin, right? Cher smiled faintly. I'm probably used to it. Hugging her knees, she looked in the direction of the kitchen and said softly, Zhou Chengguang, I know you want me to reconcile with him so that you can explain it to Qin Mu, but it's impossible. She looked at him and said calmly, but if you really like Qin Mu, please treat her well. Zhou Chengguang's expression was somewhat solemn. Why? I hope that the two of you can be together. Actually, it's not that great. I just feel that I left unwillingly back then. If everything was destroyed in the end, I would feel even more unwillingly, she said in a low voice. Without waiting for him to speak, she spoke in a soft voice that pierced through Zhou Chengguang's heart. In this lifetime, you owe me everything. Return it all to Qin Mu. Zhou Chengguang closed his eyes. Even now, he could still remember the scene when he saw her on the campus, the way she looked asleep. That was a dream that he had hidden in his heart. Even when he was old, he would never forget it. However, the dream in his heart hated him. She had said it tactfully, but she had expressed it very clearly. Zhou Chengguang was speechless for a moment. After a long time, he sighed softly. I will. He looked in the direction of the kitchen, but he could only see the back of his little wife. She was talking to Yi Muyin. He could tell that she had a very gentle expression on her face. It was not like when they were together at all. It had been a long time since he had seen her like this. In the past, when she looked at him, her eyes would also be filled with pink. As Zhou Chengguang thought about it, he looked at Cher again. I'll get back her love. Cher did not say anything. Zhou Chengguang finally understood what was going on. In the kitchen, Qin Mu watched as Yi Muyin washed the burnt pot and put in new rice to make porridge. Chapter 22:12. She asked worriedly, Brother, what happened to the wound on your forehead? Yi Muyin said calmly, It's nothing. He paused for a moment and looked at his sister. There's always a price to pay for taking advantage of a woman. Qin Mu immediately covered her mouth, suppressing her voice. Was it Xue who hit him? Yi Muyin nodded seriously and patted his sister's shoulder. Don't tell anyone else, or your brother will lose face. Qin Mu's gaze was a little complicated, and his voice was also very slow. Brother, what did you do to Xue? Why did she hit you like that? Yi Muyin tilted his head and smiled. She went too far. As a result, Qin Mu instantly understood. Her brother's gaze was way too lascivious. But she immediately asked, shouldn't these minor injuries be fine? When she came, she met the hotel doctor, and he said that he had a high fever. Was it really okay? I took cold water to wash myself in the middle of the night. Yi Muyin lowered his voice and taught his sister a shameless lesson. Qin Mu was speechless. She stared at him for a long time and said slowly, Brother, you're so lame. How dare he play the trick of hurting himself? If Cher knew about it, she would definitely ignore him. That's why I can't let her know. Yi Muyin looked satisfied. Qin Mu swallowed his saliva before speaking his mind boldly. But it seems like Xue doesn't feel that bad for you. Look, if you want to eat some porridge, you have to get up and cook it yourself. Mr. Yi looked at his sister and was speechless. She doesn't know how to do it. I don't think she needs to learn it. Qin Mu said matter-of-factly. I don't know how to do it either, but I don't need to know it at all. She looked at her brother mockingly and concluded, Brother, you're just a masochist who has nothing better to do. With that, Qin Mu walked out and ignored him. Yi Muyin snorted and said, Qin Mu, you just said that you can do it without learning it, right? Qin Mu almost bit off her tongue. She turned around and said with a fake smile, But I can't guarantee that it won't burn. You do it. The man who had been attacked by his sister said with some revenge, and then put the blame on his sister. Qin Mu didn't know how to do it. She was speechless. If she had known earlier, she would have said that her brother's trick of injuring himself to gain the confidence of others was great. Yi Muyin walked back to the living room happily. Zhou Chengguang looked at him and didn't see his little wife. He was surprised and asked, Where's Mumu? In the kitchen. Yi Muyin smiled and said, She's making porridge for me. Zhou Chengguang knew that Qin Mu didn't do housework. How could she know how to cook porridge? If he knew, how could Yi Muyin not know? He did it on purpose. He really played the trick of hurting himself. Only Qin Mu, That fool would be fooled by her black-bellied brother and obediently send herself to the door to be a cook. However, no matter how much he despised her for not living up to his expectations, his heart still ached for her. He got up and met Yi Muyun's gaze for a moment before saying indifferently, "Let me do it." Qin Mu has never done these household chores before. Yi Muyun smiled and said, "Then I'll have to trouble you, Zhou Zong. You're willing to do it. I didn't force you." Zhou Chengguang thought, "You win. I can't beat you." Chapter 22:13. When Zhou Chengguang walked into the kitchen, Qin Mu looked up at him in surprise. "Why are you here?" Zhou Chengguang looked around and smiled. "I'm here to see if there's anything I can help with." "Oh," Qin Mu said. She lowered her head and stirred the boiling water. She had never done housework before, so she was flustered and didn't even know how to make porridge. She didn't pay attention, and the boiling water splashed on the back of her hand. Qin Mu let out a cry. Her voice was low, and she looked very pitiful. Zhou Chengguang grabbed her wrist and frowned. "How is it?" Qin Mu frowned and pursed her lips tightly. She didn't say anything for a long time. Zhou Chengguang checked and sighed. "Why are you so stupid? Fortunately, it's not serious." He turned around to get some ointment and applied it on her. When he passed by the living room, his evil brother didn't even look at her. After applying the ointment on Qin Mu, Zhou Chengguang looked at her with disappointment. "You don't know how to cook, but you still want to show off." Qin Mu looked at him as if she was glaring at him. After a while, she snorted. "Don't treat me like Cher, who doesn't know anything. Then what do you know?" Zhou Chengguang put his hands in front of him and looked at her coldly. "Do you know how to play the guqin or draw?" Qin Mu was still staring at him. "Yes, that's all I know." She looked very cute when she was angry. She was not like before, when she had to bear it no matter how angry she was. Zhou Chengguang smiled. "It's good enough that you know these." He leaned forward and pinched her little face. His voice was very calm. "I can do these rough jobs." She didn't know why, but Qin Mu heard some shamelessness in his words. She wanted to ask, but she couldn't, so she could only sulk. Zhou Chengguang skillfully washed the rice, put it into the pot, and covered it. Qin Mu sat at the small dining table, holding her chin and looking at his back. He was quite good at doing these housework. She knew that when they lived together in the house in Qingshui Road, he had never cooked. Did he learn all these skills in another woman's room? Qin Mu thought like this and asked the same question. Zhou Chengguang turned his body sideways and looked at her. "Do you want to know?" Qin Mu pursed her lips. "I don't want to know." He sighed and walked to her side. He reached out and pulled her little head into his arms. He said softly, "I only took care of Gu Mei for a few days when she was sick." As he said this, Qin Mu refused to stay in his embrace. What was he now? Did he want to make up with her, take Gu Mei back, and start his previous life again? Qin Mu didn't want to embarrass her brother, so she said in a low voice, "I don't want to talk to you about this." Zhou Chengguang's voice was a little gentle. He kept looking up at her. "Mumu, this is the past I can't deny. Instead of letting you know in the future, it's better to..." Qin Mu covered her ears. Zhou Chengguang, "I don't want to hear this at any time." She was a little breathless after saying that. She stared at him and pursed her lips. Zhou Chengguang suddenly felt incredibly gentle. He reached out and rubbed her long hair. "Silly girl." Qin Mu looked at him with tears in her eyes. "I'm not." Chapter 22:14. Zhou Chengguang walked over, looked at the porridge, and continued in a faint voice, "Mumu, Gu Mei and I are not as close as you think." In fact, he knew that he had so many women, but the only one Qin Mu cared about was Gu Mei. Qin Mu snorted. "We've been in close contact. How is that not intimate? You've been taking care of her for a few days. Mumu, are you jealous?" His voice was low and hoarse, and then he laughed again. "But I've never served Gu Mei's brother." When he said that, Zhou Chengguang was in a trance. Yes, he and Yi Muyun were enemies. For Qin Mu, he seemed to have let go of too much. But now that he suddenly realized it, he didn't regret it. Qin Mu snorted. "You can go. No one wants you to serve me here." He carried her on his back and began to cook the porridge. His voice was clear and shallow. Mumu, I'm willing. After finishing his work, he squatted in front of her in a humble manner. He held her little hand and looked up at her. Mumu, forget everything in the past. Let's start over, okay? Qin Mu pursed her lips and looked at him. After a long time, she said in a hoarse voice, Zhou Chengguang, I can't do it now. But he knew that she had loosened up. At least she didn't refuse, didn't she? He reached out and rubbed her long hair. His voice was low and hoarse. I'll wait until you're willing, but you have to stay by my side. I'm afraid that once I let you go, you'll disappear. Qin Mu tried her best to calm down, but it was difficult. Her lips trembled slightly, and she couldn't say a word. She was held in his arms, and he cherished her in his heart. Qin Mu felt that it was a little unreal. How could she and Zhou Chengguang have such a day? He treated her just like her brother treated Cher at that time. She couldn't tell if it was real or if he was playing. She only knew that she was falling into the abyss, unable to extricate herself. Qin Mu ran away in a sorry state, while Zhou Chengguang was pushed aside by her. He wasn't annoyed. He just smiled and looked in the direction that Qin Mu escaped. After a while, Cher walked in and asked with a frown, what happened? She's probably a little embarrassed. Zhou Chengguang smiled. Because she can't even make simple porridge. Cher looked at him in disgust and snorted. Then you probably learned it from another woman. After saying that, she clapped her hands and stood up, ignoring him. Zhou Chengguang rubbed his nose, indicating that these girls had all grown up and were not to be trifled with. After Cher left, Yi Muyun arrived. He was already neatly dressed in a black shirt and black slacks. He exuded a sexy aura that was different from usual. He sat opposite Zhou Chengguang with an indifferent expression. Zhou Chengguang served him like a little wife and even made a side dish. Unexpectedly, Yi Muyun praised him lightly, making Zhou Chengguang feel like he was fucking a dog in his heart. Looking at Cher at the door, he coughed lightly again. Mr. Yi, you have to take care of yourself. You can't neglect your body anymore. Don't do things like taking cold showers. He was extremely straightforward. If Cher still couldn't understand him, she would have to be stupid. She stood at the door and looked at Yi Muyun with widened eyes. Did he use the trick of self-injury? Chapter 22:15. She stood at the door and stared at Yi Muyun with her eyes wide open. Did he get a fever because he took a cold shower? Was that why it was inflamed? It was a trick of self-injury. If looks could be used as a knife, Yi Muyun would have been stabbed all over his body. At this moment, Zhou Chengguang got up and left with satisfaction. He patted the smell of oil off his body. Mr. Yi is quite childish now. Yi Muyun looked at him. Believe it or not, my words are still very effective on Qin Mu. I believe in my influence on Qin Mu more. Zhou Chengguang said confidently. Yi Muyun smiled. President Zhou really can't be mentioned in the same breath as before. Zhou Chengguang also smiled. Of course, people will change. As he said that, he left slowly. As soon as he left, Cher exploded. Yi Muyun, you are shameless. Yi Muyun looked at her. Can you use some new words to scold me? I'm a little tired of these words. Cher was so angry that her face turned pale and then red. She could only stare at him. He was angry and amused at the same time. He reached out to her. Come here. I will teach you how to scold people. I don't want to learn. She was angry and wanted to run away. But he was very fast. She only ran for a while before she was caught in his arms. His fever had not completely subsided. His arms were hotter than usual. She was buried in his arms like that. She wanted to struggle, but she could not. Yi Muyun held her little body firmly and said with a seductive voice, You are angry just like that? He leaned close to her ear and said in a low and warm voice, You should say. He taught her a lot of words shamelessly. Cher could not bear to listen to him. She covered her ears and refused to listen. Yi Muyun chuckled softly and teased her even more shamelessly. Deep in love, she still kissed her on the lips. Cher resisted, a little disgusted. You will infect me. This isn't contagious. He chuckled, pressing her down and kissing her to his heart's content. When he kissed her lips one last time, He asked seriously, Cher, have you learned everything I've taught you? She was afraid that he would teach her again, so she blushed and softly fell on his shoulder. Her breathing was erratic. I know. Then take the initiative to kiss me once. His voice was hot, with a hint of teasing. Cher bit her lips. He laughed even more wantonly. What I just taught you was kissing. Cher was speechless. Could he be any more shameless? However, his heart ached for her. So he let her eat some porridge first and specially said, Zhou Chengwang's cooking is not bad. Cher stared at him and finally understood what Zhou Chengwang meant. Her gaze was also a little deep. She didn't say anything and lowered her head to eat the porridge. What's wrong? You look like you're afraid of me. He smiled faintly and reached out to stroke her long hair. Cher pursed her lips and said slowly, I just feel. She looked at him. You wouldn't have used such tricks on me in the past. Yimian looked at her and smiled. People change. Besides, these little tricks are nothing. Nothing? Cher murmured. Then if I lie to you one day, will you forgive me? Will you still think that it's a joke? He looked at her and smiled faintly. Of course, I can forgive you for everything. Cher looked at him. Everything? Chapter 22:16. Cher shook her head and replied indifferently, no. That was because they had broken up 8 years ago. No matter what she did, she could not say that she had let him down. Yi Miyun pursed his thin lips as his gaze deepened. They were unusually silent. In this silence, each of them was filled with their own thoughts. He was thinking about what had happened to her in the past 8 years that even Gu Zhe could not find out about. He wanted to ask, but he knew that she would not say it. Between them, it was even more difficult than between Qin Mu and Zhou Chengguang. Zhou Chengguang and Qin Mu only needed Qin Mu to think it through and turn back. And his Cher was not someone who was willing to turn back. He could feel that it was only expedient for her to be with him. Her concern was out of guilt as well. As long as he let go, she would be able to turn around and leave. As for him, how could he possibly let her go? He would not even if he died. After a long time, he smiled out faintly and pinched her little face. I believe that you wouldn't dare to. She knew that he was either compromising or changing the topic. Forcing out a smile, she finished the porridge. Zhou Chengguang's dishes are pretty decent. If he's serious about Qin Mu, he'll definitely be a good husband in the future, Cher said in a low voice. Yi Miyun looked at her. What about me? Can I? Cher replied awkwardly, you'll have to ask your fiancé about that. Not for the time being. So, I'd like to ask you if I'm all right in all aspects? When he said all aspects, he emphasized each word with a deep meaning behind it. Cher harumphed out softly. I'm not sure. I don't understand. There's no comparison. Still, those words pleased him as he did not make things difficult for her anymore. Pulling her along to rest, he called the F&B of the hotel and ordered lunch before going to bed. When Cher heard that he had ordered a rather luxurious meal, she glared at him. How can you eat such a sumptuous meal when you're sick? I ordered it for you. He laid down and pulled her into his arms. His large palm caressed her small body. I can't let you drink porridge with me, can I? Otherwise, people will say that I didn't raise you well. At this moment, the two of them were lying together, and they were actually quite intimate. Cher also knew that she couldn't break free. Moreover, he was sick, so she just let him be. Her little face rested on his shoulder, and she still spoke clearly. Yi Miyun, I will return to America. Everything that we have now is all. Her little mouth was kissed. He didn't kiss her for long. He just pecked her lightly, not letting her say anything that would make him unhappy. After a long time, when both of their auras were a bit chaotic, he said hoarsely, I know. Cher's little face rested on his shoulder, and her voice was a little low. Do you want me to apologize? No need. His voice was a little heavy. Don't mention it when we're together, or I'll get angry. Cher didn't say anything and buried her face in his neck. After a long time, Yi Muyun felt that his neck was wet and warm. He opened his eyes abruptly and looked at her. Cher, are you crying? There were tear stains on her face. She didn't want him to see it, so she buried her head and cried. At this moment, she wasn't saying that they were a one-night stand. Instead, she was like an 18-year-old girl who was helpless and fragile and needed him to coax her. He cupped her little face and wanted to comfort her, but she refused. Chapter 22:17. She hugged his neck and hugged him tightly. Don't ask, can you hug me? In America, on the streets, in the dark alleys. She missed him so much, but he never appeared. She had imagined so many scenes. She could bury herself in his arms and cry like this. And now, it had finally come true. Perhaps she came back not because she was safe, but because she wanted to see him. Him having a girlfriend was just an excuse for her. She simply wanted to come back to see him. Schwelver looked up at him, her small and full lips trembling slightly. Slowly, she leaned forward and kissed him softly. Yi Muyun didn't move. She was the one who initiated everything from the kiss to the end. This was the first time she had taken the initiative ever since they had sex. He felt that the person in his arms was no longer that young girl, but a mature woman. She was so familiar with his body and knew how to make him happy. She did not hold back and pleasured him. At the height of his passion, his throat moved and he made a shameful sound. It was soothing and lingering. When it was over, everything was so beautiful. Are you okay? Her little face was placed on his chest, listening to his intense heartbeat. The sound was also lingering. Yi Miyun smiled faintly and looked down at her. This should be asked by a man. Her little arms hugged his waist tightly, and she buried her face in his arms again. But I did something that only a man would do just now. He reached out his hand and touched her black hair. Her sweat was damp, and it was cool. Cher lay in his arms and closed her eyes. Yi Muyun's gaze was unfathomable. He could feel her feelings, but even more so, he could feel that her actions were resolute. Cher, let's get married, okay? He suddenly said. The person in his arms opened her eyes suddenly. She didn't raise her eyes, but looked straight at the nearest place. After being stunned for a while, she said softly, Isn't it good for us to be like this? Why don't we get married? He said hoarsely, We've done it many times, sometimes without protection. Maybe we already have a child. Cher's gaze became even more focused. Child? She sat up with the sheets and looked at him. There won't be any children. Yi Muyun's gaze was a little cold. Did you take your medicine? No. It's not easy for me to get pregnant. Cher smiled faintly. Falling into the frozen lake once, Gong Han. Do you know what that means? Yi Muyun was naturally aware of this. Startled for a moment, he said almost immediately, If we don't have a child, we can adopt one. Cher looked at him. Yi Muyun, I like life in New York. I'm sorry, but I can't marry you, let alone adopt a child with you. She had a feeling that she couldn't stay any longer. He had already sensed something and didn't want to let her go. Therefore, she couldn't care less and was ready to hand him over to Qin Mu to take care of. She had to leave. She got out of bed and went straight to the changing room. After a while, she came out with a new set of clothes. Yi Muyun did not stop her, because he knew that she would definitely go back to B City. Her things were all in B City. His gaze was a little distant as he took out his phone and made a call. Help me find a lawyer. Chapter 22:18. Yi Muyun said calmly, Just do as I say. Guze was silent for a long time, but he didn't say anything in the end. Yi Muyun hung up the phone, took out a cigarette from his pocket, lit it, and smoked slowly. He stood by the window and looked at the sea in the distance. After a long time, he went into the changing room and changed his clothes. There was a black limousine parked at the entrance of the hotel. Yi Muyun got into the car and asked calmly, Has everything been arranged for Miss Tang? The driver nodded and said, Don't worry, Mr. Yi. I've arranged for someone to send Miss Tang to the nearest airport. Yi Muyun closed his eyes and leaned against the back seat to sleep. He hadn't fully recovered yet, and he still had a fever. But since she had left, there was no point for him to stay, so he might as well go back to City B. Of course, Yi Muyun took a private plane back to City B, 2 hours earlier than Cher. At the airport, when Yi Muyun's private plane took off, Cher sat in the waiting room, holding the phone in her hand. After hesitating for a long time, she called Qin Mu. After about 4 or 5 rings, Qin Mu answered, Cher? Cher said softly. I'm at the airport. Qin Mu was stunned and asked instinctively, Where's my brother? He's still in the hotel. Cher pursed her lips. You can go and have a look. Qin Mu hung up the phone, looked at Zhou Chengwang, and kicked him. What kind of lousy show is this? It's a reality show, and there's no one here. After saying that, Qin Mu walked towards the door of the room, and Zhou Chengwang immediately followed her. But when they arrived at Yi Muyun's bedroom, only the waiter was cleaning the room and said that he had checked out. Qin Mu was stunned for a moment, and then she turned around and left. Where are you going? Zhou Chengwang grabbed her arm and asked in a low voice. Qin Mu looked at him. I want to go back to B City. However, Zhou Chengwang didn't let go of her hand. He said in a low voice, Mu, they have to solve their own problems. You don't live for them. Qin Mu struggled with all her might, but she couldn't break free. She looked at him and said word by word, But because of me, they gave up once. She struggled fiercely, and this time he released her. Because he realized that he couldn't find a reason, Qin Mu quickly returned to her room and packed her things in a flurry. Zhou Chengwang pressed his hand on the back of her hand and said in a low voice, I'll clean it up. She looked at him. What about your show? Ruined, he said casually. Just take it as a vacation. Qin Mu pursed her lips and asked him to prepare the plane. In the end, both Qin Mu and Zhou Chengwang returned to B City, but Cher hadn't arrived yet. Originally, Qin Mu wanted to wait for someone at the airport, but Zhou Chengwang took her away. Qin Mu, the more you act like this, the more Tang Shui will want to escape. Your brother is already suffocating her. Now that you're here, think about it. In the end, Qin Mu listened to his opinion and got into the car that came to pick her up. After half a day of running, she was so tired that she fell asleep. Zhou Chengwang looked at her neck and smiled. Didn't she feel uncomfortable? He reached out to pull her head onto his shoulder, and his gaze became gentle. He looked at her like that until they reached the house in Qingshui Road. Qin Mu was probably too tired. When the driver opened the door for them, she didn't wake up. Chapter 2219. Mr. Zhou? Xiao Zhang hesitated for a moment. Should I wake him up? No, you can rest first, Zhou Chengwang said calmly, then picked up Qin Mu and walked to the hall. Qin Mu woke up. Looking at the lights in the hall, she seemed to have recognized the place. She struggled a little and said, Why are we here? Sleep a little longer. Stay here for now. Zhou Chengwang's voice was very soft and comforting. Qin Mu pursed her lips. She couldn't fight against the drowsiness, so she fell asleep. She felt very tired. She had been very tired recently. She had a vague feeling in her heart, but she didn't know if it was true. It shouldn't be. She had always been taking medicine. Zhou Chengwang put her on the soft bed and sat by the bed, looking at her quietly. Her little face was a little pale because of the long journey, and her eyes were closed quietly. He looked at her like this, and he felt satisfied even if he looked at her without any feelings. He thought that he might have fallen in love with his little wife after she finally learned to play with him and be rough with him. He also lay down and lay with her in his clothes. This feeling was wonderful enough. Qin Mu didn't wake up until 10 o'clock at night. She opened her eyes and saw Jun Yin in front of her. Only then did she remember that he had brought her here. Qin Mu pursed her lips and said in a hoarse voice, Why are you here? You asked that when you came. He smiled. Mumu moved back. Qin Mu looked down and said indifferently, I don't want to do this. What are you worried about? He leaned against the bed and stroked her long hair. If you're worried, we can sleep in separate rooms. Qin Mu was a little surprised and looked up at him. Zhou Chengwang was still smiling. If you don't want it. Qin Mu's face was slightly red as he snorted. I've never thought about it. Then we'll sleep in separate rooms. His forehead rested against hers. You've got to give me a detention, don't you? Qin Mu didn't say anything, so he knew that she was trying to trick him. Then he chuckled softly. All right, let's go downstairs and eat something, I want to see my brother. Qin Mu looked up and grabbed his sleeve with her slender fingers. Zhou Chengwang looked at her little hand with a burning gaze, and Qin Mu immediately moved her fingers away. He smiled and did not expose her. Then he got up and carried her in his arms. Put me down. Qin Mu immediately hugged his neck and said anxiously, You said we slept in separate rooms. His eyes were clear and bright as he stared at her dainty little face. He slowly said, But I didn't say I wouldn't hug you. Shameless. Qin Mu reached out and punched him, but those punches and rusty legs did not hurt him at all. Instead, he smiled and went downstairs. When they reached downstairs, Qin Mu realized that the servants in the house had returned, and they were the people she was used to using in the past. Are you touched? He placed her on the dining chair and sat opposite her. He smiled. It wasn't easy to invite them back. I'm just short of apologizing. She knew what he meant. She snorted. It's none of my business. You did it willingly. Zhou Chengguang gestured for the dishes to be served before he said slowly, Yes, I did it willingly. Qin Mu did not want to pay attention to him because it meant that she was losing. She didn't want that. She still hadn't thought it through. Chapter 22:20. Zhou Chengguang pursed his lips and didn't force her. He just served her food from time to time. The servants at home were all watching. Qin Mu was a little embarrassed. She said in a voice like a kitten, Enough. Eat more. You're too thin. He smiled and supported his good-looking chin. It won't feel good. Qin Mu couldn't stand it and growled, Zhou Chengguang. There were other people here. How could he speak so bluntly? He didn't care and lowered his voice. It's normal for a husband and wife to say some sweet words. However, Qin Mu was a conservative child. Her face was still red after a while. After eating, she asked him to take her to Yi Muyun's apartment. When Zhou Chengguang got up, he complained, You only have your brother in your heart. Don't you have your husband? Qin Mu opened the car door and got into the car. After sitting down, she snorted, We're getting a divorce. That's right. But we only had sex 3 times this morning, didn't we? He turned his face and kindly reminded Mrs. Zhou. Mrs. Zhou's face was completely red. This time, she couldn't say a word. She regretted going back to Qingshui Road with him. When Zhou Chengguang started the car, he gently pinched her little face. Do you regret it? Yes. She didn't stand on ceremony and directly admitted it. He chuckled and drove the car out of the villa. The black sports car drove at a speed of 60 kilometers per hour. Because it was late at night, there weren't many cars on the road. After a while, Qin Mu turned around and looked at him. You can drive faster. Mu, be careful. He took the time to glance at her, then took out a cigarette, lit it, and took a puff. The driver now is a man who has been indulging himself too much. Qin Mu, Zhou Chengguang, can you not mention this? Qin Mu's voice was a little annoyed. Zhou Chengguang rolled down the window and rested his elbow on the window. His tone was indifferent. You won't let me do it. Can I talk about it? She laughed again. Mrs. Zhou, you're meddling too much. Qin Mu turned his face away and didn't say another word. She looked at the dark night outside and suddenly remembered that this was the first time she had sat in his car. After being together for so many years, other than at home and on necessary occasions, they rarely spent time together. Qin Mu felt a little emotional. She didn't like to talk and just played with her fingers. After smoking a cigarette, Zhou Chengguang stopped. He held the steering wheel with both hands and drove toward Yi Muyun's apartment. But when she arrived, Yi Muyun wasn't in the apartment. Qin Mu dialed his number, but it was busy. After hanging up the phone, she looked up at Zhou Chengguang and said, I can't find my brother. Zhou Chengguang pursed his lips and took her cell phone. Ask Gu Zhe. As he spoke, he found Gu Zhe's number. When he flipped it out, he looked at his wife with a meaningful gaze. Under his gaze, Qin Mu almost exploded. Zhou Chengguang, you and Gu Mei are not clear. Don't suspect others. I didn't say that. He smiled meaningfully and then dialed the number. Let me speak. Qin Mu wanted to grab the phone from his hand, but Zhou Chengguang grabbed her with one hand and pulled her into his arms. Then he said to Gu Zhe, I'm Zhou Chengguang. Mu wants to know Yi Muyun's whereabouts. Chapter 22:21. She didn't know what the other side said, but Zhou Chengguang soon hung up the phone. He looked at Qin Mu and said lightly, Your brother is in the company. He's fine. The company's doctor is waiting by his side. Don't worry. Qin Mu pursed her lips. She wanted to go over, but thinking of Zhou Chengguang, she gave up. She grabbed her phone and snorted, "Don't touch my phone in the future." "Why, is there any secret?" He smiled mysteriously. Qin Mu rolled her eyes at him and said, "If you want me to have it, I can have it too." As soon as she finished speaking, she was pulled into his arms. "Are you angry?" His voice was a little hoarse. "As a husband, I'm just declaring my sovereignty." She wanted to ridicule him, but he interrupted her. "Do you dare to say that Guze doesn't have feelings for you?" Qin Mu stared at him for a long time, then turned around and said, "You're bored." Zhou Chengguang followed behind her and grasped her hand, their fingers intertwined. He walked forward with her. She couldn't get rid of him, so she could only let him be. Qin Mu had never known that Zhou Chengguang was such a thick-skinned man. She had been blind before. "Mu, let me take you out to play," he suggested. Qin Mu looked a little disinterested. "It's getting late. I want to sleep. You've only slept for 3 hours. Mrs. Zhou, do you want to be a pig?" He said with a smile, "I insist on my right to have the best touch." Qin Mu couldn't communicate with him anymore. "Zhou Chengguang, why didn't I find that your mouth is so cheap?" Her tone was not very good. However, Zhou Chengguang had a good temper. He chuckled and said, "My body is even more cheap. Do you want to try?" When a man was shamelessly rubbing against you, it was impossible to refuse. Qin Mu reluctantly walked on the road with him, went to eat skewers, and even went to the bar to have some fun. In the end, Qin Mu drank a little too much and got drunk. Zhou Chengguang carried her on his back to the parking lot. It was a long way. In the late autumn night, with her little body behind his back and her arms around his neck, he felt as warm as a scarf. He had never felt such warmth in his heart. It was as if he had returned to the past. A young wife who wanted to divorce him gave him a sense of home. He had not had a family for a long time, but now everything seemed to be complete again. He carried her on his back and coaxed in a low voice, "Mu Mu, who is the man you like at the moment? Right now?" Qin Mu lay lazily on his shoulder and narrowed her eyes. She really drank too much. "Now!" Her voice was soft, and then she reached out and pinched his face. That was really painful. However, Zhou Chengguang was a little shameful and happy in his heart. He asked in a low voice, "Is it me?" Qin Mu was probably addicted to playing with him. She sat up straight and pinched his face with her little hands, twisting it around as if she was playing with a ball. This was the first time that Zhou Chengguang was in such a sorry state. He endured it for the answer he wanted to hear. When Qin Mu had enough, she leaned against his ear and laughed in a very low voice. That faint laughter went into his ear and was indescribably seductive. Just as he was about to lose control, Qin Mu bit him and said naughtily, "It won't be you." Chapter 22:22. He should have been angry. He had carried her on his back for so long, but she was still angry at him. But in his heart, there was only tenderness. He breathed lightly and said gently, "Qin Mu, then don't like anyone else, okay? Even if you hate someone, you only hate me, okay?" Qin Mu tilted her head, thought about it carefully, and nodded. "Okay." She reached out and grabbed his hand. "Then it's a deal? Well, but in this case, we will never be separated so that you can hate me forever. Is that okay?" He teased her because she had drunk too much. Qin Mu nodded. "We will never be separated. I will think of ways to torture you every day." She must have thought of something interesting as she giggled. She looked really cute. Zhou Chengguang suddenly put her down and kissed her on the street in the middle of the night. He hugged her tightly, as if he was hugging his whole life, as if he wanted to integrate her into his bones and blood. He knew that she was the one he wanted. The dream was still a dream, and she was the real person who had been with him for 8 years. "Mu Mu." He kissed her until she couldn't breathe. Finally, he loosened his grip a little and looked at her seriously. "Don't leave me." She didn't answer and just looked at him blankly. That expression was something that only the 14-year-old Qin Mu could have. That year he didn't take her, and sometimes he regretted it. But tonight he seemed to have returned to the past. The man's hatred was vividly displayed at this moment. Zhou Chengguang carried her and walked to the parking lot. 5 minutes later, he put her in the back seat of the car. Chin Mu was a little sober. I want to sit in the front. Good girl. He coaxed her, sat in the car, and closed the door. The dark and narrow space was a little cramped, mixed with the smell of alcohol and his breath. Although Chin Mu was drunk, she could guess what he wanted to do. She licked her lips nervously and shook her head. I don't want to in the car. But he was already kissing her, as if he was determined to do it. Chin Mu took advantage of the fact that she was drunk and cried desperately. She didn't care if anyone outside could hear her. She was crying and kicking him, but he really couldn't do anything to her. Zhou Chengwang was also very distressed. He frowned and kissed her comfortingly. Mumu, it'll be fine in a while. He knew she wasn't used to it, but he couldn't stand it anymore. He kissed her and coaxed her, but she still cried. In the end, he could only cover her little mouth, not letting her make a sound. Chin Mu was no match for him, and he still managed to burn himself in the car once. An hour later, Zhou Chengwang let go of her and said in a hoarse voice, Mumu, are you okay? She kicked him. Get lost, she said with a hint of sobbing in her voice. I hate you the most. She said she hated him, but he wasn't angry. He kissed her little neck and coaxed her. But you said you liked me just now. I didn't. Chin Mu's face was a little hot, and she denied it without confidence. Zhou Chengwang smiled, sat up, and pulled her into his arms. Then he took out his cell phone and played a recording for her. Chin Mu's face suddenly changed. Chapter 22-23. Chin Mu glared at him. Zhou Chengwang, you're despicable. He didn't care about her angry stare and continued to play the recording calmly. Chin Mu wanted to grab it, but she forgot that she was in a mess. She fell into his arms, which was exactly what he wanted. He threw the phone aside and kissed her in his arms. Chin Mu couldn't struggle and could only be held in his arms. When he was finally done kissing her, he pressed his beautiful thin lips against her little mouth and chuckled. If you want to divorce me again, I'll send this recording out. Let's see who else dares to want you, okay? Chin Mu glared at him, but she didn't have any power at all. Zhou Chengwang smiled, held her with one hand, and put on her clothes with the other. I'll wear it myself, Chin Mu said. On the one hand, she was angry, but on the other hand, she was a little uncomfortable. They had been husband and wife for so many years, but after they had sex, they seemed to wash their own clothes and didn't have much intimacy, let alone take care of her like he did now. However, Zhou Chengwang insisted on doing this. His voice was low and hoarse. Be good, don't move. He reached out and firmly helped her put on her clothes, while Chin Mu curled up like a shrimp in his arms. Zhou Chengwang had never thought that she was so beautiful and cute. How many years had he missed? Although he couldn't calm down, his tone was still indifferent. Are you going home? Chin Mu didn't say anything. She hugged her body and rolled to the side. He knew that she wasn't used to this, so he put on his clothes and climbed into the driver's seat. As he fastened his seat belt, he said slowly, this kind of thing will happen often in the future. You have to get used to it. Chin Mu was furious. He was really shameless. She threw a pillow at him, but it didn't hit him. Zhou Chengwang chuckled, as if teasing her was a very happy thing. When he started the car, he suddenly remembered that when she mentioned the divorce, she had said that he was dirty. Thinking of this, his throat was a little blocked. After a long time, he said in a muffled voice, Mu, forget about the past, okay? Chin Mu didn't say anything. She just hugged her knees and looked at the dark night outside. It was a big change that she didn't refuse. He didn't force her, but his heart was sour, sweet, heavy and heavy. He wanted to vent all kinds of emotions, but he couldn't do that. He was afraid that he would scare her. He wanted to take it slow. Back at the villa, the warm yellow light illuminated every inch of the living room, and the piano by the floor-to-ceiling window was opened again. He sat in front of her and played to Alice for her over and over again, to her over and over again. He said that he would play until she was willing to come back to him. Late at night, Chin Mu finally couldn't take it anymore. He sprawled on the armrest of the sofa and fell asleep. At the night, Chin Mu, Chin at Mu, Chin, Shun, Sheng, Xing Mu, At the end of the song, he closed the lid of the piano, got up, and walked toward her. He leaned over and kissed her little face, then stared at her quietly. Qin Mu was very beautiful. As she grew older, she became more and more mature, very much like Yi Lianqiu back then. One must know that back then, Yi Lianqiu had stunned the entire world, but his Mu had only stunned time. He didn't want his wife to show her face in public, and he didn't want her to go out and be seen by other men. It was also because of his selfishness that the reality show ended without any success in the end. Chapter 22-24. This feeling was different from the feeling he had for Tang Sher when he was young. At that time, he was young and full of vigor, but now that he had experienced everything, he should have passed the age of hot-bloodedness, but he was still like this. He leaned into her ear and said in a low and hoarse voice, Mu, let's start over, okay? He had asked this question many times, and only she would not refuse him when she was asleep. As he spoke, he smiled and pressed his face against her little face, whispering sweet nothings in a low and hoarse voice. How could there be a day when I like you so much? If I had known, Mu, I wouldn't have hurt you like that. He reached out to pick her up and went straight upstairs. In the end, he carried her to her bedroom. Zhou Chengguang bent his legs, half-knelt beside her, and helped her change into her pajamas. When he did all this, it was not that he did not touch Yunyan, but he was concerned about her mood and that she should be very tired, so he could not bear to torture her again. After covering Qin Mu with a blanket, he looked at her for a long time before dimming the bedside lamp and leaving. When the door closed, Qin Mu slowly opened her eyes. She looked at the boundless night and pursed her lips. Her heart was not unshaken. After all, for 4 or 5 years, she had given Zhou Chengguang her purest teenage years. She had loved this man so passionately. At this moment, he was pursuing her. It would be a lie to say that she was not tempted at all. However, Qin Mu knew that she had to hold on to the last line. She could no longer completely give herself to a man like before. She did not want to be hurt again, not at all. Qin Mu reached out to hug herself and let herself fall into the darkness. That night, Yi stood in the top-floor office of Boi, with Gu Zhe by his side. Mr. Yi, things have changed a little? Gu Zhe's voice was solemn. I haven't taken action yet, but a media outlet has exposed on the internet that ANN's work, Rainy Night, is a plagiarism of the famous Chinese artist Lan Yu's masterpiece, Cloudy Sky. Yi stared at Gu Zhe for a long time before he said, Show me the picture of that painting online. Gu Zhe pulled out a picture from his phone, which was obviously prepared in advance. Yi took a look and frowned deeply. He knew that with Cher's personality, she would never plagiarize his work. However, the two paintings were so similar, and their souls were so compatible. It would be too much of a coincidence if they had never met before. Yi narrowed his eyes with a solemn expression. Gu Zhe hesitated for a moment and asked, Mr. Yi, do you want to solve this problem for Cher? He wants to find Lan Yu and solve it in private. As long as Lan Yu doesn't sue or even comes out to explain, it won't cause any trouble. Yi didn't answer him immediately. Instead, he walked quietly to the floor-to-ceiling window. He stood there and looked at the dark night outside. After a long time, he said softly, Gu Zhe, search for Lan Yu again and see his information. Gu Zhe was stunned. He had been with Yi for many years, so he could usually guess what Yi was thinking. Gu Zhe took the notebook and quickly searched for Lan Yu on Baidu Baiki. A long list of information came out. Gu Zhe was stunned when he saw it. Chapter 22-25. He was very thin and tall. His facial features were different from those of pure Asian men. They were very three-dimensional, and his eyes were amber. In short, he was a young and very good-looking man. Gu Zhe said softly, Mr. Yi, I found him. Very young, isn't he? Yi voice was very indifferent, and he didn't turn around. Gu Zhe didn't know how to answer. After a long time, he softly replied, Gu Zhe, tell me, what kind of relationship do you think they have? Yi closed his eyes. Don't investigate. Let things develop. Guzei's emotions fluctuated slightly. He stood behind Yi Muyun and didn't say anything. He just accompanied him to watch the dark night outside. After standing there for a long time, Yi Muyun said softly, "Guzei, do you feel lonely standing so high?" Guzei couldn't answer. He used to think that climbing to the highest place was his life's dream. But now, he stood there, but he didn't feel a trace of excitement. His heart was left at that place by the sea. He didn't speak for a long time. Yi Muyun stood there, his slender hand supporting his forehead. His voice became even lower. "Guzei, even if we know that we're lonely, there's no turning back." As he said that, he slowly turned his head and looked at Guzei with a smile. "Let's go for a drink. How about it?" Guzei closed his eyes slightly and let out a long breath. "Okay." The two of them went downstairs together and drove their respective sports cars to the bar called Night Color. Because each of them had their own thoughts, they didn't control themselves. After an hour, they were almost drunk, but only to the point of being slightly drunk. Because after drinking, some words could be said, especially for Guzei. The words that had been suppressed for so long, the words that couldn't be said could be said at this time. At this time, he took 10 cans of beer outside and sat on the rooftop, enjoying the night wind. After finishing a can, he crushed it and threw it far away. Guzei turned his face and fixed his eyes on Yi Muyun. 8 years ago, you sacrificed Cher for Qinmu. This time, are you going to sacrifice Qinmu for Cher? Yi Muyun just looked at him quietly. Guzei laughed mockingly. He leaned back and placed his hands on the concrete floor. He raised his head and casually unbuttoned 2 buttons on his shirt. "You clearly know that Zhou Chengguang isn't Qinmu's lover. They will always have problems when they are together. Zhou Chengguang is on a whim now, and his whole heart is with Qinmu. But what about in the future?" He said firmly, "If he hurts Qinmu again, have you thought about the consequences?" Yi Muyun said calmly, "Zhou Chengguang's sincerity is to transfer 20% of King Entertainment's shares to Qinmu." Guzei was stunned. Yi Muyun patted his shoulder. "I'm not the kind of brother who doesn't care about Qinmu's life. I just feel that it's better to leave with a broken heart. Otherwise, with Qinmu's temper, she probably won't be satisfied. She wouldn't be satisfied, probably because of Gu Mei." Guzei let out a long sigh. "So you think Zhou Chengguang is your true love? I'm willing to give them a chance." Yi Muyun said fairly. "This has nothing to do with me and Cher." Guzei smiled and directly lay on the cold concrete floor, looking up at the stars. "Then why don't you consider me?" he murmured, his eyes a little warm. Chapter 22-26. Guzei looked up and smiled bitterly. "Yes, I can't do it." He might have been able to do it in the past, but he couldn't do it now. He had given up on Gu Mei once and let her go to jail. He really couldn't do it again. Yi Muyun lay down and looked at the starry sky with Guzei. The two men suddenly looked at each other and smiled. "Find a woman to marry." Yi Muyun patted his shoulder and stood up unsteadily. He walked towards the exit while Guzei lay there without moving. After a long time, he covered his face with his hand, his Adam's apple moving uncontrollably. At the bottom of the building, Yi Muyun walked out of the elevator with his coat in his hand. Standing at the bottom of the building, he suddenly had a feeling that he didn't know where to go. He didn't drive and just kept walking. Before he knew it, he had reached the entrance of GM Hotel. She had returned to B-City and should be back at the hotel now. Yi Muyun raised his head and looked at the bright signboard of GM for a long time before finally walking in. The receptionist naturally recognized him, but she was still very surprised because Mr. Yi had always been noble. When did he become like this? A few buttons on his shirt were unbuttoned and the cuffs were rolled up to his elbows. They were a little wrinkled and his coat was even a little gray. The receptionist was busy staring at him. Yi Muyun's voice was very calm. "Has Miss Tang returned to the hotel?" "Miss Tang?" The receptionist was stunned for a moment before she understood what he meant. She thought for a moment and quickly said, "She just returned to the hotel. She should be in her room now." "Don't call her." His voice was low and full of warning. How could the receptionist offend this man? Bowie was now under the management of Mr. Yi and President Tang. You almost didn't care about anything. However, she found it strange that Mr. Yi and Miss Tang had broken up for so many years, but Mr. Yi was still in Bowie like a son-in-law. It was really amazing. With that, Yi Mian walked towards the elevator. As he stood in the elevator, his mind went blank. All that was left was Gu Zhe's words. Lanyu was quite good-looking and very young, but he didn't want to look. Instinctively, he didn't want to look. He was waiting for the final result. Unless Cher brought that man to him, he didn't want to look at that man. The elevator went all the way down and stopped at the top floor with a ding. Yi Mian stepped out of the elevator and walked 2 steps to the door of her suite. This was the place where they had intercourse countless times. Earlier on, she had even taken her here, and she was still living here. If she still loved him, then what was that man? Yi Mian walked to the door, but he didn't knock immediately. Instead, he smoked a cigarette. After he finished smoking, he reached out and knocked on the door, avoiding the peephole. Cher thought it was room service, so she didn't suspect anything and opened the door. She was wearing a bathrobe, so she must have just taken a shower. As soon as she opened the door, her slender arms were pulled into an embrace by a pair of strong hands. Then her body was pressed against the hard door, and her head was firmly pressed against it. Then hot lips blocked her little mouth. She struggled instinctively, but he didn't let go of her. He pressed her fiercely, one long leg directly stuck in her, lifting up and holding her body in place. Chapter 22-27. Just like that, they kissed for a long time without a care in the world. Finally, she was exhausted and gave up struggling. Her body went limp and was at his mercy. Yi Mian nibbled on her neck and buried his burning face in her neck. He said in a deep voice, "Tell me, what happened to you in the past 8 years?" Her body jerked and her legs went limp. If it wasn't for him holding her up, she would have slipped down long ago. Why? Scared? He looked up slightly and held her face with his slender fingers. However, his gaze was cold. "You don't dare to say it?" Cher pursed her lips and said in a low voice after a long time, "It has nothing to do with you. Yi Mian, we broke up a long time ago. It was 8 years ago. Have you forgotten?" He took a step back. Her legs finally went limp and her body slid down. She hurriedly held onto the door behind her to prevent herself from falling. Right now, she wouldn't allow herself to fall in front of him. "That's right. Broke up?" He suddenly walked up and pinched her delicate chin with his strong hand. His voice was so cold that it was like ice. "Tang Cher, who said that we broke up, His strength seemed as though he was going to crush her bones. Cher held onto the door behind her and tried her best to resist the pain. She looked pathetic and tears welled up in her eyes. If it was in the past, how could he bear to do this to her? But now, anger and uneasiness made him lose his rationality. There was only a crazy thought in his mind, and that was to lock her up and not let her go anywhere or let anyone find her. Cher looked at his expression and was a little shocked. He was crazy. She swallowed her saliva with difficulty and said stubbornly, "We broke up. Have you forgotten? Have you forgotten Song Karen's existence? She was never a problem." He growled at her. "I didn't touch her." As he said that, he bit down on the soft flesh behind her ear as though he was venting his anger. She cried out in pain, but he didn't let her off. His voice turned colder. "Tell me, have there been any men who have treated you like this all these years?" Cher couldn't take it anymore. She bit her lip and said, "Yi Mian, you bastard." His expression was extremely ugly as he stared at her and sneered. "Am I a bastard? Then I'll show you the bastard side of me." As he said that, he kissed her lips fiercely again. At the same time, he did many things to her with his large palms. She struggled with all her might, but to no avail. Her bathrobe slid down to her shoulders soon. There were a few bite marks on her smooth shoulders, all of them stained with blood. He had never treated her like this before. She was in so much pain that she almost fainted, and he even wanted to take her right in front of the door. At the critical moment, the elevator chimed. The room attendant held her tray and stared blankly at the erotic scene in front of her. She didn't know what to do. One was Mr. Yi, and the other was the young Miss Aboyi. It was obvious that the young miss had been forced to do it because she had bitten so hard that she was bleeding. The attendant pursed her lips and didn't dare to make a sound for a long time. She just stood there in a daze. Yi Muyin finally realized the existence of a third party. He hugged Cher and growled, "Get lost!" The attendant's heart skipped a beat, and she immediately took the elevator and left. Chapter 22-28. Her eyes were filled with tears. "I don't owe you anything." All of his movements came to an abrupt halt. His face was buried in her neck as his breathing was hot and messy. Just like that, he buried himself in her neck for a long time before saying in a low and bitter voice, "Yes, you don't owe me anything." Slowly, he let go of her and took 2 steps back. But his gaze did not let go of her as he looked at her with an unfathomable depth. Cher's body was trying her best to hold on. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked up at him. Her expression was deep, but not overbearing, yet it was moving. But he did not know if it belonged to him alone. At that moment, he really wanted to ask her who Lan Yu was and what was his relationship with her. But a man's pride and the fact that he had loved her for so many years made him unable to ask. "I'm sorry, I drink too much." He stroked his forehead with his slender fingers and chuckled. "Sorry to have offended you." Cher's eyes were wide open like a frightened rabbit. Her face was pale, and she looked so weak that she could collapse at any moment. Yi Muyun smiled again. It was a very faint smile as he stepped back into the elevator. The elevator door closed, blocking their line of sight. At that moment, his face darkened. Her little face, too, became even more sorrowful and fragile. When Yi Muyun reached downstairs, he did not leave immediately. Instead, he sat down on the sofa in the lobby. Because of his presence, the manager on duty walked over with small steps. "Mr. Yi, do you have any instructions?" Yi Muyun held a cigarette and smoked lightly. After smoking half a cigarette, he said, "Get someone to send the food up." The manager knew where to send the food, so he said with a solemn expression, "We will do it even if Mr. Yi doesn't say it." That soul-stirring scene from earlier had already spread throughout the GM. The love entanglement between Chairman Yi and their family's young mistress was still unsettled. Wasn't there someone called Song Karen? In the end, when Missy came back, she could not even be considered as cannon fodder and was sent flying. Come to think of it, Mr. Yi only had eldest miss in his heart. That made sense. Back then, the Golden Boy and Jade Girl were the envy of countless people. After the manager finished speaking, he went to take care of it himself. Yi Muyun sat there alone and didn't leave. He felt a little tired, and all the muscles in his body ached. He wanted to rest. Only when he laid down did he feel that lying down was so comfortable. Only then did he realize that he hadn't really had a good rest all these years. Because all these years, he had been waiting for her, to the point where he couldn't sleep at night. He was lying on the bed with his shoes on and his coat casually tossed aside. Moreover, he was drunk. He was really down and out. The receptionist whispered to each other, "Is Mr. Yi fighting with the little devil upstairs again?" "Isn't that right?" the other said quietly. "If you ask me, Mr. Yi will give in the end." "Why?" The previous receptionist didn't understand. "I remember that scary Mr. Yi upstairs. When I saw him, I would be like a mouse seeing a cat. Mr. Yi is really authoritative." The other one snorted softly. "If he was authoritative, he wouldn't be drunk here." Although Mr. Yi didn't look happy for the past 8 years, when did he ever look so pathetic? The other one was convinced immediately. That's also. Chapter 22-29. Don't, it's better if you catch a cold. The one upstairs will be heartbroken when he comes down tomorrow. She had to admit that the GM's front desk was full of drama. Just like that, Yi Muyun lay in the lobby of the hotel for the whole night. Early in the morning, Cher got up and went for a jog as usual. When she passed by the lobby, she paused for a moment because she saw Yi Muyun. She slowed down and looked at him quietly for a while before walking to the front desk. "Why is Mr. Yi lying here? Didn't he go home?" The receptionist was still the same as last night. She was about to get off work. "It's because Mr. Yi insisted on sleeping here and refused to go back home." Cher glanced at them and said calmly as she walked out, "Call Vice President Gu and ask him to pick him up." The receptionist gave her a perfect smile. Vice President Gu probably drank too much last night. Now, he's probably sleeping on the road. Cher turned back and looked at the receptionist. She shook her head and didn't say anything in the end. They could sleep wherever they wanted. She wore a set of white sportswear and walked out of the hotel, ready to jog for half an hour. But as soon as she walked out, a large group of reporters surrounded the door, holding up their interview placards and asking questions. "Miss Tang, your work Rainy Night has been reported as plagiarizing the popular artist Lan Yu's Cloudy Sky. How do you explain this?" "Miss Tang, the public opinion is very unfavorable to you. Will this ruin the reputation of ANN, a rising star?" "Miss Tang, you are the only heir of Boy. Why did you do such a shameless thing like plagiarism?" The reporters surrounded her, as if they had gone crazy, wishing that every inch of her flesh and blood could be used as gossip to exchange for benefits. If it was the Cher from 8 years ago, she would probably shrink back. But she was different today. Her petite body was drowned in a large crowd, but she didn't panic at all. Instead, she said calmly, "What evidence do you have to prove that I plagiarized?" Everyone was silent because no one had expected her to ask such a question in such a righteous manner. Amidst the silence, a female reporter displayed her extraordinary fearlessness and straightforwardly said, "Based on the scenery and artistic conception of these 2 paintings, Miss Tang, do you think you could deny it? Not many people know that I'm Miss Tang and I'm a member of ANN. Who ordered you to do this?" Cher chuckled. "No matter who reported it. Did Mr. Lan Yu come forward to testify against me?" Silence reigned once more. What kind of identity did Lan Yu have? He was an internationally renowned artist. Why would he come to be city so easily? "Miss Tang, you probably think it doesn't matter because of your family background, but I want to tell you that art is sacred and inviolable." The female reporter didn't want to give up. Cher was very clear in her heart that she was probably Song Karen's person, guiding the direction of a group of people's opinions. She only smiled faintly. "Really? Then what do you think I should do? Apologize to Mr. Lan Yu and prove that I'm guilty of plagiarism?" The female reporter's face turned red. Shouldn't that be the case? Chapter 22:30. As she spoke, she looked straight at the female reporter. "Tell your boss that I am ANN, and also Tang Shuer. If she wants to touch me, she has to weigh her own weight first." The female reporter's face turned pale and then red. The other reporters were shocked too. When they came, they were like sharks that smelled blood. When they left, they were a little dispirited. Cher looked at the direction where they left. She knew that things wouldn't end just like that, because some people wouldn't give up. If she couldn't do it openly, she would do it secretly. She pursed her lips and dialed a number. When she picked it up, her gaze became gentle. "Lan Yu, is Shu there?" The voice on the other side was very elegant. "He's asleep." After a pause, he continued to ask, "When will he be back?" Cher bit her lips and said after a long time, "There's some trouble, so it might be delayed for a few days." "Is it that Rainy Night?" His voice was very calm. "Do you need me to show up?" Cher was stunned and immediately shook her head. No need. She was just bluffing and didn't really want him to show up. The other side was silent for a while before saying, "Come back soon. Ishu misses you very much." Cher grunted in acknowledgement and slowly put down the phone. A few meters behind her, Yumian looked at her quietly. His face was pale, almost without a trace of blood. He couldn't hear it clearly, but he heard that her voice was very gentle. She would only talk like this when she was talking to someone she was familiar with. He was sure that that person was Lan Yu. What kind of relationship did they have to be able to draw the same painting and have a compatible soul? When Cher turned around, she saw him. She also saw his pale face and the impending storm. Did he hear it? She bit her lips and didn't say anything. He didn't either. The two of them looked at each other quietly, with their own pride. She thought that he would get angry eventually, but he didn't. He just looked at her for a long, long time before he turned and left. 2 hours later, Yi Muyun entered the VIP ward of Xingyuan Hospital. Guze dragged his hungover body and was summoned over. When he entered, he was also slightly shocked. Mr. Yi didn't drink much last night. How did he end up with a perforated stomach? He almost died. After the surgery, he was as pale as a sheet of paper, but he was conscious. Guze sat beside him and sighed. Mr. Yi, what do you want me to do? The truth was clear now. Cher's relationship with Lan Yu wasn't an ordinary one. Moreover, Mr. Yi was such a proud man. Would he not be able to take it? Or did you settle it for her and let her go? Guze asked softly, because at that moment, he really couldn't figure out what Yi Muyun was thinking and what kind of decision he would make. After he said that, Yi Muyun's voice was a little soft. Guze, in your heart, you always feel that I've let her down, don't you? Guze couldn't say it out loud. Among them, the biggest victim of what happened 8 years ago was Tang Cher. Everyone knew that Mr. Yi didn't want to admit it because he didn't want to let go. If he said that he hated her, he would have more reason to pester her. If he said that he had let her down, why would he pester her? Chapter 22:31. That was what Guze thought in his heart. Yi Muyun narrowed his eyes and continued. If she really fell in love with someone else, why would she be willing to sleep with me? Guze hadn't opened his mouth yet. Moreover, he couldn't say such a private thing. However, Mr. Yi was too thick-skinned. How could he say such a thing? Yi Muyun's eyes were burning. She wasn't forced. She enjoyed it, and she would take the initiative. Guze sighed in his heart. Mr. Yi, you look like this, and you both have a past. If you insist on doing it, which woman can refuse? That's a woman's normal physiological reaction. Okay? However, it was understandable that Cher still had lingering feelings for Mr. Yi. However, men could eat what was in the pot and look at what was in the bowl, but women couldn't. Moreover, she could make a trip to B-City, get some stock, and then return to America. She still had a handsome husband waiting for her. It wasn't a loss at all. Guze thought in frustration in his heart. He only dared to think about it, but he didn't dare to say it out loud. What do you mean, Mr. Yi? He had asked anyway. What should he do? He couldn't just pretend that nothing had happened, could he? Yi Muyun looked at Guze and said very softly, lead the major media to prove that she plagiarized. Guze was slightly surprised. He really didn't dare to think about it. He hesitated for a moment. Mr. Yi, if Cher finds out, she probably won't forgive you. Yi Muyun lay quietly, his eyes looking at the white ceiling of the ward. On his face, there was nothing but weakness. Then he said something that made Guze's heart jump. If she isn't with me, then why do I need her forgiveness? Guze was speechless. After a long silence, he said, I understand. Yi Muyun nodded and casually took a cigarette from the bedside table. He wanted to smoke, but was stopped by Guze. He pinched the cigarette in half and threw it away. He also confiscated the entire pack of cigarettes. Do you want to die? Smoking right after the surgery? After a pause, he continued, they just spoil you too much. Yi Muyun did not resist. He continued to stare at the ceiling. After a long time, he let out a long sigh. Guze, I am so cruel to you. Why do you still follow me? He tilted his head. I know that with your current ability, it's very easy for you to go out and become a CEO. Why do you have to submit to others? Guze said faintly, that wasn't Mr. Ye's fault. It was Gumei's fault. As Gumei's brother, he just happened to fall in love with Qinmu. He had not reached the point where he couldn't live without Qinmu. Although Mr. Yi couldn't live without Tang Cher, at least his soul was gone. What was alive was just an empty shell. Yi Muyun closed his eyes gently. Don't tell anyone that I'm hospitalized. Guze understood what he meant. He quickly went out and arranged for someone to take care of him. Guze's heart trembled a little when he did this because he needed too much. But because of his operation, Cher's matter became a big deal. The mainstream media no longer had any scruples and reported it desperately. There were even people speculating that all this was instigated by Mr. Yi and that Boyi was pressuring him. Because of a painting, there was an uproar. But the CEO of Boyi, Mr. Tang Yu, was abroad and had not come back. He did not clarify and let the little girl make a fuss, which was really puzzling. Chapter 2232. In the next few days, the comments outside became more and more intense. Coupled with Song Karen's slanderous words, A&N's reputation went from being a rising star in the art world to a shameful plagiarist. The reporters outside the GM hotel were simply waiting, and they had no intention of leaving for 3 days and 3 nights. The security guards of the GM hotel tried many times, but they couldn't get rid of them. Cher had been in the hotel for 3 days and hadn't gone out at all. Once she went out, she was surrounded by reporters. She was also getting more and more panicked because she knew that in such a situation, only someone could make the mainstream media speak out. It must be someone powerful. And Song Karen didn't have such ability, nor did she have such courage. Cher didn't look for her, but went to the headquarters of Boye. She drove a fully enclosed black sports car from the underground parking lot and got out without a hitch. The car stopped at the entrance of Boye, and she found that there were also many reporters there. No matter how good Cher's temper was, she still cursed and opened the door to get out. Before she came, she had already informed the security guards, so when she appeared, the reporters were blocked by the security guards. She came over and didn't tell Yi Muyun that it was Gu Zhe who received her. Gu Zhe was different from the mess he was the other day. He was wearing a decent handmade suit and stood there with a smile. Mr. Yi is not in the company now. Cher pushed him away and said angrily, "I don't believe it." With that, she went straight to the elevator. Gu Zhe wasn't annoyed. He followed behind her slowly and went upstairs together. If he lost to a little girl, how could he climb up? As soon as they reached the top floor, Cher kicked open Yi Muyun's office. Yi Muyun come out, but the office was quiet, and there were a lot of documents on the desk. It was obvious that he hadn't been in the office for a few days. "I said that Mr. Yi is not in, but you didn't believe me." Gu Zhe's tone was gentle. "How about this? I'll ask my secretary to make you a cup of coffee and rest here for a while. If there's anything, I can solve it." Cher looked at him coldly. "If Yi Muyun didn't give the order, would you dare to do it?" Gu Zhe rubbed his nose. "All right, but Mr. Yi is not here. He's in the hospital." Shue pursed her lips and dashed towards the elevator. She was in a rush. Gu Zhe touched his nose again and smiled. The little girl's temper has grown a lot over the years. Sigh. "I feel sorry for the sick Mr. Yi. I wonder how he'll be tormented later." Gu Zhe smiled and went downstairs with her. In the end, he got into his car and drove her to the hospital. Vice President Gu would never admit that she purposely went to watch the show. On the road, Cher didn't say a word. Gu Zhe wanted to tease her, but failed. In the end, he sighed and said, "Cher, when did we become so distant?" Shue tilted her head and looked at him. Suddenly, she laughed coldly. "Gu Zhe, are you wooing me?" Then, she smiled even colder and said darkly, "How about this? Let's go to the hospital together now, and tell Yi Muyun that you like me and want to be with me. How about that?" Gu Zhe's hand that was holding the steering wheel fluttered, and then the sports car swayed on the road. He quickly held it steady and then returned to the right track. He coughed and said, "This joke isn't very funny. He would probably be skinned alive." Chapter 2233. Gu Zhe didn't say a word. All right, only Mr. Yi could take the blame for this. He sent Cher to Xinyuan Hospital and went to park the car. Cher went up first. She knew that he would be staying in the VIP ward, so she went straight up. Everyone in the hospital, from the director to the nurses, knew her. When they saw her, they naturally thought of Mr. Yi. Was Miss Tang here to visit Mr. Yi? That should be the case, right? But Miss Tang's expression didn't seem to indicate it. Hence, no one dared to make a sound. They all retreated to the sides and watched as Miss Tang opened the VIP ward like a goddess of vengeance. At that moment, everyone was praying for Mr. Yi, hoping that Mr. Yi would be able to pull through. When Cher opened the door, Yi Muyun was sitting on the bed. There was an A4 in his arm, and he was reading a Bible in his other hand. When he saw Cher, he smiled faintly. "Why? You're here to visit a patient? But shouldn't you bring something to visit a patient?" Cher stood at the door, her face tense. "Mr. Yi is reading the Bible. Is it because you've done too many bad things, and so you need some peace of mind?" Yi Mian looked at her calmly and smiled faintly. Mr. Yi, I remember that we just had sex not long ago, and we did it several times in one night. Now you're calling me Mr. Yi, huh? Cher's face tensed up even more. All right, Yi Mian, does this show our relationship? He remained seated and looked at her indifferently. You're the one who got the media to chase after that painting on that rainy night and plagiarizing it, aren't you? Her voice was cold. Yi Muyun's eyes darkened. He looked at her calmly for a long time before he smiled faintly. What do you think? She was stunned. She hadn't expected such an answer. However, she was used to fooling around in front of him. Now that she was tricked by him, she was so angry that she reached out and pulled out his foredrip. Immediately, beads of blood appeared on the back of his hand and seeped down one by one. She was a little frightened. Although she was so fierce before, she was also frightened at this moment. Why can't the bleeding stop? She stared at him with a pale face, unable to react for a moment. She just stared blankly. After a long time, she finally remembered and immediately wanted to run away, but he reached out and caught her. Cher bit her lips and struggled with all her might, but his grip was firm. However, when he exerted force, the blood on the back of his hand seeped out even more. What? You want to run away after doing something bad? There was no smile in his eyes. He threw the Bible into her arms and said, You should read this. Cher bit her lip and lowered her head to look at the back of his bleeding hand. She whispered, I'll call the nurse. His voice suddenly raised a few octaves. Tang Cher, do I still have a place in your heart? She was stunned. Slowly, she looked up at him. Yi Muyun's eyes had a tinge of bitterness. If I didn't ask this, you wouldn't have come to the hospital to see me, right? His face was pale. He grabbed her hand and looked deeply into her eyes. Cher bit her lip the entire time, unable to say anything. He had come over in a threatening manner, but now it was all gone. It was all because he was bleeding. Chapter 2234. There's no need. His gaze was burning. My injury isn't on my hand, but here. His finger gently pointed at his heart. It's here, but you can't see it. She couldn't say a single word and could only stare at him like that. Tang Cher, don't you have anything to say to me? His voice had a tinge of desolation that could simply penetrate her soul. She suddenly felt flustered and felt that she had come to the wrong place. No matter whether he was the one who did it or not, she shouldn't have come. But she couldn't break free. His strength seemed to have been waiting for her. She was embarrassed and annoyed, but at the same time, she was sure that he was the one who did it. She said angrily, Yi Miyun, you're too despicable. Is loving you despicable? He said weakly but straightforwardly. Cher pursed her lips. Loving someone is fulfilling their wish. Fulfilling your wish with someone else? His voice became extremely cold. Tang Cher. He reached out and pulled her into his arms, not caring if his wound hurt or not. He said in a deep voice, Tang Cher, don't even think about it. Their eyes met. His eyes were filled with indignation and anger that completely surpassed hers. Her expression was extremely helpless, as though she would always be that weak little girl in front of him. She had never changed. At this moment, Guzet pushed the door open and entered. The moment he entered, he saw that the scene inside was a little bloody. He held his forehead and smiled helplessly. In the end, he turned around and called the nurse over. Reattach the drip for Mr. Yi. In the ward, Yi Muyin was still locking Cher's hand and didn't let go. It was almost as if he was stubborn. When the nurse came, she said carefully, Mr. Yi, please give me your right hand. But Yi Muyin only gave her his left hand. His gaze was still on Cher's face, and his voice was extremely indifferent. Hang this hand. The young nurse had no choice but to do as she was told. She lowered her head and carefully hung it up for him. Guzet wanted to watch the show, but in the end, he didn't come in. Instead, he chose to stand outside. The nurse was the same. She ran out as soon as she was done with her work, as if there was a ghost behind her. In the ward, Cher's voice was clear and cold. Mr. Yi should be tired. I won't bother you anymore. However, he held her in his arms with one hand and buried his face in her neck. As if venting his anger, He bit her hard. Tang Shui, you're trying to escape again, aren't you? I didn't. She sighed softly. I didn't. Yi Muyun, I've said that I don't owe you anything in the past, and I still don't owe you anything. He suddenly let go of her and looked at her as if she was a stranger. After a long time, he chuckled. Yes, you don't owe me anything. Is that why you feel at ease? She couldn't answer him because the relationship between her and Lan Yu wasn't what he thought it was. However, she didn't want to explain, and she couldn't. She just lowered her little face and smiled faintly and helplessly. I don't feel at ease. If Mr. Yi wants to hear an apology, I can say it. After you say it, you can let me go, right? There was a hint of exasperation in his voice. Cher's lips trembled slightly. After a long time, she said, yes. Chapter 22:35. He leaned back, picked up a cigarette with his bloody hand, and said faintly, let's go. As he leaned there, Cher found that his hospital gown was also stained with blood. She still couldn't leave immediately. Instead, she pursed her lips and said softly, I'll call the nurse. I won't die. He said indifferently, Tang Cher, if you don't intend to look back, don't pretend to care about me. His voice was cold. You should care more about yourself, or Lan Yu. When she heard him say Lan Yu's name, her body shook, and her lips trembled slightly. Finally, she stood up and walked straight out. When she walked out of the ward, she heard a violent sound behind her, and even the sound of something heavy falling. She pursed her lips. Childish. But as soon as she said that, she wanted to cry. She bit her lip and held back her tears for a long time. A pair of big hands patted her on the shoulder, and then it was Gu Zhe's gentle voice. Did you quarrel? Shui Er's eyes reddened as she looked at Gu Zhe. He was still as gentle as before. It seemed that time had not changed much on him, but she knew that he had changed and was not the same as before. In the past 8 years, everyone had hidden their own thoughts in their hearts. Many things could not be changed, and they could only accept it, just like her and Yi Muyun, like Gu Mei and Zhou Chongguang, and like Gu Zhe had Mumu in his heart. She shook her head and said softly, Take good care of him. Don't you hate him? Gu Zhe suddenly said in a very calm voice, If he really did it. No. Cher raised her eyes and smiled at Gu Zhe, but her smile was paler than crying. Gu Zhe walked up to her, reached out for the first time, and gently stroked her little head. He said gently, There will always be a result. Cher, tell your heart. Who do you like? Is it still Mr. Yi? There was the sound of water in her eyes, but she couldn't say anything. Gu Zhe smiled again. Wait for me in the parking lot. I'll take you back to the hotel after I settle things here. Cher didn't refuse, but she turned back after taking 2 steps. She looked up at Gu Zhe and asked hesitantly, Will he be all right? Gu Zhe stroked his handsome chin and smiled. I think I won't die, but if you continue to anger him, who knows? Cher pursed her lips and glared at Gu Zhe with a strange expression before running away. Gu Zhe smiled. In fact, Cher hadn't changed at all. However, she didn't change because of Mr. Yi. Deep down, she was already a mature woman, but subconsciously, she retained a part of her innocence. That was the memory of her and Mr. Yi. Even the current Lan Yu should be irreplaceable. Gu Zhe watched her leave, then turned around and walked into the ward. As soon as he entered, he sighed in his heart. They were really a good match. Fortunately, he let Cher leave first. Otherwise, she might faint if she saw Mr. Yi like this. At this time, Yi Muyun's wound, which had just been operated on a few days ago, was completely torn. His hospital gown was full of blood, and the ward was in a mess. Everything was broken. The back of his hand was also full of blood, which was thrown on the ground. Gu Zhe frowned. Mr. Yi, you're courting death. Chapter 22:36. Yi Muyun stared at Gu Zhe in the bloody light, which was quite scary. Gu Zhe shrugged. What I said is the truth. Or is it that Mr. Yi feels that there is no hope and wants to give share to someone else? Oh, and I remember that Mr. Tang Yu has already transferred 20% of his shares to you, right? Well, if he died of anger, everything would belong to someone else. Yi Muyin was still staring at Gu Zhe. Gu Zhe said casually, "It will be the same if I change the owner. Think about it, Share is not very good at managing the company. Maybe I can do whatever I want in the company in the future, and then become the actual owner of Boyi." Gu Zhe smiled. "Of course. All this is based on the foundation that you will die of anger, Mr. Yi." Yi Muyin almost spat out a mouthful of blood. Listen, was this what Gu Zhe said? This was what Vice President Gu, whom he had promoted personally, said. Just these few words were enough to make him vomit blood. Why would he need share? Seeing that it was about time, Gu Zhe immediately walked out quickly. He ran into the nurse outside and quickly gave a few orders in a low voice. Just now, he seemed to be very relaxed and joking, but in fact, he was not relaxed. Mr. Ye's injury seemed to be very serious. If he was not treated, he was afraid that something big would happen. Gu Zhe had a strong psychological quality. After quickly giving orders to the little nurse, he called the director and asked the best surgeon to come over. When he walked into the ward again, Yi Muyin was almost unable to hold on. He held him and couldn't help scolding. "You are clearly sick, but you were still so angry with her. If you had been a little softer, she wouldn't have left like that." This was what Gu Zhe was thinking, and only at this time did he dare to say it to him. Because Yi Muyin was proud, he usually didn't listen to it, or even if he did, he would get angry. In his heart, Tang Share was his possession from childhood to adulthood. It was only during the 8 years that they were separated that she was his, both physically and mentally. Now that the incident with Lan Yu had happened, although their relationship was not clear yet, it was enough to make Mr. Yi feel jealous. Yi Muyun's face was pale, and he did not speak for a long time. After a long time, he gritted his teeth and said, "Let's go to the operating room." Gu Zhe was relieved. He immediately helped him to the bed and pushed him to the operating room. When had their CEO, Yi, ever been in such a sorry state before? Because the wound was quite serious, the surgery lasted for more than an hour. Fortunately, it did not hurt the inside. After Yi Muyin was pushed out, Gu Zhe was relieved. He also thought of Shui Air in the parking lot. However, when he was about to go downstairs, he saw Cher in the corridor outside the operating theater. She leaned against the wall, lost in thought. Gu Zhe frowned and walked over. His voice was very soft. "Why are you here?" Cher looked at him and pursed her lips. "I heard it from a nurse, so I didn't leave." She paused before asking, "How is he?" "You're not going to see it for yourself?" Gu Zhe looked up at her as he took out a cigarette and took a puff. Cher didn't say anything. Her expression was a little deep. Gu Zhe held a cigarette between his slender fingers and looked at her. "I was so angry with you just now that the wound was torn by 5 centimeters. As he spoke, he gestured and coughed softly. "It's even bigger than the incision in the operating theater." Chapter 22:37. Cher pursed her lips tightly. "Are you still not going to see him?" Gu Zhe's voice was soft. "The doctor said that he's in a critical condition tonight. He'll be fine if he doesn't have a fever tonight." Seeing that she was still as unmoving as a mountain, Gu Zhe quietly took out his killer's gin. "However, you can't be blamed for Boss Ye's illness. She fell ill during the reality show a few days ago. She didn't recover at first, but then she ran back again. She didn't even rest, and her stomach perforated." This touched the deepest part of Cher's heart. She knew better than anyone why Yi Muyun had a fever, and then they slept together for a night. She pursed her lips and said softly after a long time, "I'll go see him." Gu Zhe laughed. "That's right. Even if we can't be husband and wife, we can still be friends, right?" Cher glared at him. Gu Zhe touched his nose again. "We're still brother and sister, aren't we?" When he said this, he was thinking that they had slept together so many times. How could they still be brother and sister? With that said, he looked at Cher. Cher followed him upstairs to the VIP ward. The ward had been cleaned up, and there was no sign of it being smashed. Yi Muyun lay there quietly, his face pale. Cher stood by the bed and looked at him. Guze said softly, I know that he's the only one you like, isn't he? If not, why would she be willing to sleep with Mr. Yi? Cher did not say anything. She just stood there and looked at Yi Muyun quietly. She felt a little pain in her heart and said softly, if I had known, I wouldn't have come back. She sometimes felt that he was cruel. Back then, he had tacitly agreed to her leaving. It wasn't that she didn't hate him, but she missed him even more. When she came back, she thought that she might bump into him. She thought that they were fine and wouldn't have anything to do with each other anymore. But she was still entangled with him. Too many assumptions made him lie here today. Is it because of my arrogance that you ended up like this? She asked in a low voice as she slowly sat down on the edge of the bed. She seemed to be talking to Guze, but it was more like she was muttering to herself. After so many years, it turns out that you can't let it go even more than I can. She could have let go of everything and returned to New York, but now that he was like this, she couldn't let go. How could she not know what he was thinking? He tormented himself and caused himself to be covered in injuries. That was his unspeakable pride. Yi Muyin would never open his mouth to beg a woman. He could only express it by hurting himself. When did he start acting like this? She was sad, but she couldn't stay for him. Guze, do you think I'm cruel? She asked softly. She did not cry because he was asleep. Ever since they were young, he had always been unshakable, standing in front of her like a god. She had never seen him fall. Was this another way for him to show his weakness? Guze said in a low voice, No, never. If he was cruel, he wouldn't have been entangled for so long. Her dilemma and uncertainty were probably because of the changes in the past 8 years. If she had known that it would be like this after 8 years, she definitely wouldn't have been willing to do that. Or rather, the changes in the middle were things she couldn't change. Guze sighed, Can't you stay? You know he needs you. Cher was stunned. After a long time, she slowly shook her head. That's just more cruel to him. She raised her head and smiled, but her eyes were filled with tears. Guze, I'll leave tomorrow. Chapter 22:38. Guze looked at her with a solemn expression on his face. After a while, his gaze landed on Yi Muyun, and he said softly, Are you going to give up on him? Cher pursed her lips, and her body trembled uncontrollably. After a long while, she said in a low voice, Yes. Guze pursed his thin lips and said calmly, Go back to America before he finds out. Perhaps this is for the best for both of us. Cher nodded her head solemnly. She looked at Yi Muyun again. He was lying there quietly, but he was still the most handsome man she had ever seen. As she looked at him, her eyes became a little moist, and she couldn't help tearing up. She said to Guze in a low voice, Can I kiss him? Guze suddenly felt extremely upset. What had happened to her in the past for her to love so carefully and hide all her emotions? For her to not dare to be with Mr. Yi? Guze pursed his lips and closed his eyes slightly. His voice was hoarse as he said, Of course. Then, Cher bent down and kissed Yi Muyun's lips gently. His lips were a little dry and a little bitter, but her tears kept falling uncontrollably and landed on his lips. His lips moved slightly, like a person who had been dry for a long time, touching the first drop of water. However, it wasn't water. It was salty. Yi Muyun's eyelids moved, and he opened them immediately to look at her. Cher's eyes widened, and she looked at him in disbelief. She wanted to escape, but his hand quickly grabbed her. Although it was weak, it was enough to catch her. His voice was hoarse and broken. Are you trying to escape again? Are you trying to escape to his side? She struggled with all her might, but she didn't dare to use too much force for fear of hurting him. Guze watched from the side and let out a long sigh. He quietly retreated and left the room for the two of them. The ward was silent. Cher lowered her eyes. Let go. One of her tears fell on the back of his hand, startling her and burning his heart. Why are you crying? He looked at her, his voice weak. It had taken all his strength to hold her. But he did not allow himself to fall, because if he did, she would probably leave. Cher shook her head. I didn't cry. Little liar. He closed his eyes tiredly. You're still so stupid. You can't even lie. When he opened his eyes again, his gaze was captivating. Tang Cher, if you don't love me anymore, I'll let you go. But you clearly can't forget me. So why should I let you go? Even in his heart, he was extremely jealous. Cher bit her lips and looked at him helplessly. His fingers slowly loosened. And in an instant, she was like a frightened bunny, shrinking back. He lay there weakly and said slowly, How you walk out, I want to see how you walk back. Cher's body leaned against the doorknob, her face full of tears. Why are you so persistent? He closed his eyes and stayed silent for a long time. Then tell me, what did we do when we were together for the past few days? Cher couldn't say it. It would be too cruel to him or her. She didn't say anything. Yi Muyun smiled and said in a self-deprecating manner, Go. Her body relaxed, but she didn't leave immediately. Yi Muyun looked at her. Why? You can't bear to leave? Chapter 2239. Shui Er bit her lip. No. She twisted her slender fingers, which was her habit of lying. She hadn't improved at all these years. He sneered again. Let's go. Aren't you afraid that I'll pester you? Cher looked at him, suddenly feeling a little desolate. This was the man she loved the most in her life. She loved him in the past, and she still loved him now, but she didn't choose to be with him. She didn't know if it was right or wrong. She didn't know if it was fair to him or herself. Perhaps she had never thought of turning back. She just wanted to know if he was doing well. She took a deep breath and walked towards him slowly, all the way to the bed. She kissed his lips. What is this? Yi Muyun's gaze was stern. Is this your last gift? Her lips trembled. No. She closed her eyes and called out, Brother. He was stunned. Then she walked away from his palm. The door to the ward opened and closed, but he couldn't see her anymore. Yi Muyun looked at her quietly for a long time. Guze walked in and let out a long sigh. Mr. Yi? Mr. Yi really shouldn't be hurting himself now. Yi Muyun closed his eyes slightly and said tiredly, Arrange it now. Don't let her leave the country. Guze was stunned. Yi Muyun slowly opened his eyes. Why else do you think Qin Mu can't leave? Guze despised his Mr. Yi deeply. He actually learned how to court women from Zhou Chongguang. However, when Yi Muyun mentioned Qin Mu just now, his heart still hurt. He smiled lightly. Okay, I'll do it. But he guessed that Lan Yu would definitely come to City B. This was what Mr. Yi wanted. Why torture yourself? Just as Yi Muyun had planned, Cher was unable to leave. Her visa was rejected and she was still staying in the GM hotel. She knew very well why she couldn't leave. It was all Yi Muyun's plan. She went to see Guze, but Guze did not deny it. He said that it was Mr. Ye's arrangement. On the third day of her stay at the GM hotel, the incident of her plagiarizing Lan Yu had reached a certain point. Cher could hardly move a single step in the hotel. Sometimes she would see news about Yi Muyun on the news. However, on the third day, she saw him leave the hospital and appear at a summit. So much blood, such a big wound, and he was discharged just like that? Through the screen, she could see the exhaustion beneath his bright exterior. He was not made of iron after all. Cher just watched. She didn't know why, but she felt extremely upset. She wanted to turn off the television, but the next news shocked her. At the GM hotel, there was a live broadcast of a press conference. It was quite a big scene. The mainstream media in City B were all present. More importantly, the main lead. Cher knew him. That person was Lan Yu. Lan Yu, who rarely appeared in the media, was tall and skinny. He was wearing a simple white shirt and a set of black casual clothes, which made him look handsome. His facial features were deep and gentle. Chapter 2240. Even if Yi Muyun had guessed it, she didn't want him to hear it. That would be too cruel to him. The elevator finally opened. She ran in, looking a little frantic. The elevator went down floor by floor until it reached the first floor. Cher ran out, still wearing indoor slippers. She grabbed the hotel staff and asked anxiously, "Which floor is Lan Yu's press conference on?" The hotel staff didn't recognize her at first and was shocked. When she recognized her, she said respectfully, "I'll bring Miss Tang there." Cher followed her to the reception room on the first floor. The staff opened a door for her. When the door slowly opened, she saw Lan Yu. Lan Yu saw her too. Cher stood there, her body almost unable to move. She just stood there and looked at him. Lan Yu's gaze landed on her. After a long time, he said softly, "My wife Tang Cher is also—" The crowd was in an uproar. Following that, the reporters followed Lan Yu's gaze and found Cher. They began snapping pictures of her, capturing her shock and astonishment clearly. Her lips moved, but in the end, she couldn't say anything. Lan Yu continued, "Rainy Night is a painting that my wife made as a tribute to me. She said that she wanted to paint it in the same series as A Cloudy Day. I don't think this is plagiarism." With that, he stretched out his hand to Cher. "Come here." Cher didn't move. She just stared at him, unable to move. Lan Yu still walked over to her slowly. He had a slight smile on his face, and he walked over to her and hugged her. This scene was captured on camera. She was brought to the stage in a daze. She didn't hear what Lan Yu said. Her gaze was fixed in the direction of the door, because Yi Muyun was standing there. His face was still pale, without a trace of expression. His eyes stared deeply at her, watching her in Lan Yu's embrace. She saw a trace of disillusionment in his eyes. Suddenly, Cher felt like crying. Why did he come? He had clearly guessed it. She didn't react at all. She didn't know that Lan Yu had kissed her, even though it was on her forehead. Then a little radish head appeared by her feet. It was Ishu, and she called out "Mommy" in a cute manner. Cher wanted to push Lan Yu's fingers away. She clenched her fists and pursed her lips tightly. She could no longer push Lan Yu away in front of Lan Ishu. Lan Yu reached out and picked up the beautiful boy. He faced the camera and said very generously, "This is my son with Lan Ishu." Cher's heart trembled. When she looked up again, there was no one there. Yi Muyun was no longer there. That place was empty, just like her heart at this moment. Xiao Ishu was placed in her arms. The warm little person hugged her neck and acted very coquettishly. "Mommy." Schwepped or kissed him on the cheek and hugged him tightly. No one would doubt that they were not three families of three, because when put together, it was very pleasing to the eye. It looked like a family